I'm hoping everyone can hear me. I'm not sure if the button is working. Uh, but yeah, comfort food. What comes to mind when you think of that phrase? Food is a powerful expression of love, vulnerability, and even identity. And there's certain dishes that we can all relate to. Uh, Elders peeling and cutting our fruit for us as a show of affection, or binging on chocolate after a bad day, extra chutney on our Afghani chips, even though our parents always insist that it's unhygienic, or trying to get the challi wala's attention when everyone else is shouting, Khan, 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 after school. But most of these associations that we have with food are positive, and that's because we look at food primarily through the lens of consumption and excess. That's our privilege. We have culinary delights like dirty burgers that have more than three patties on them, or we'll have freak shakes, buffets, free refills. All of this revolves around food giving us comfort. At the same time, these relationships are becoming increasingly impersonal because food is just another activity we partake in. क्या करना है? चलो कुछ खाते हैं यार, which relegates this rich human experience to a passive time pass. We stop engaging with food beyond the superficial relationship. And I understand why we wouldn't want to think about animals being slaughtered or people being exploited for our dinner. But we've become allergic to even having an unsavory conversation about food. There's this implicit agreement that food and discomfort don't belong together. Why? We're very okay with acquiring tastes, which is in and of itself an uncomfortable experience. Like if you think about it, it's Stockholm syndrome for your taste buds, for your tongue. So why do we actively ignore this unpleasant but very necessary flip side of the culinary coin? A big part of it is vulnerability. In order to embrace food or any visceral experience that requires human connection, we have to make ourselves vulnerable, which is an uncomfortable feeling because sometimes it feels bad. Food tells stories. It tells stories of how we got to where we are. It also tells stories of where we are right now. Often these anecdotes are about it bringing us together, but tonight I'd like to go a step further and share my vulnerability with all of you. Food does bring us together, but it also often does the opposite, where it draws structural boundaries that differentiate us from them, me from you, based on what and how we eat. My most powerful memory of this involves a kid named Muzammil Mirza. And it was when I was in seventh grade in the US. Muzammil and I were the only two Pakistanis at school, which immediately after 9/11 should have brought us close together. Except I had been in the US for years at that point, and I was still struggling for acceptance among all the cool kids who had names like Matt and TJ and Jonathan. So during an icebreaker, they asked us what our favorite foods were. And we said things like, cheeseburgers, PB&J, pizza. Muzammil didn't. Muzammil said biryani. And all of the American kids started laughing. All the cool kids started mocking him. Hi, my name is Muzammil, and my favorite food is blah, blah, blah. And they kept making fun of it. And he turned to me, and I was the only other Desi kid in the class. So he turns to me and he says, come on, man, you know what that is. Spoiler alert. Yes, of course I know what biryani is. We all know what biryani is. But I was a 13-year-old, and I had been bullied for the majority of my life growing up for being the weird outsider. And I was this close to getting acceptance and fitting in with the cool kids. So Muzammil threatened all of that progress I had made, and I couldn't allow that. So I looked him in the eyes and I said, no, bro, I have no idea what you're talking about. And I started laughing along with the other kids. That look of hurt and betrayal in his eyes, that haunts me to this day, to the point that I still can't eat a plate of biryani without thinking about him. Now, I'm sure some of you can relate. Either you've been in my position or you've been in Muzammil's. And I've experienced the same thing even here in Beacon House, where kids were regularly shamed for their lunch boxes, both what was inside the lunchbox and also how it looked on the outside. So I don't know how many of you remember from going to private schools here, but there were tiers. It was like a system of hierarchy, where the coolest kids had those metal tiffins with the cutlery inside and like a nice meal prepped from home. Then the second tier were kids who could afford to eat at the canteen. Then was those fancy plastic containers that had like the carrot and the chili pepper sides and like different Japanese prints on top. And finally were the kids who just had generic Tupperware style containers. Then came what was inside those lunchboxes, where we would judge children for having a smelly salin or a soggy pakora or paratha. And we'd trade our sandwiches for his brownies and her cup of Sprite from the canteen for this Shami burger. But we often reduced kids to their social worth, and that was determined by what their mothers or their cooks prepared for them that day. And this classism is so deeply entrenched in our culinary history that even today, the term burger has gained mainstream acceptance, but none of the nuance or conversations about privilege that should accompany it are ever discussed. Food can even be traumatic. I struggled with an eating disorder the majority of my adult life. And in a culture of shame that permeates the entire act of eating, it's really not surprising. We use words like guilty pleasure or cheat meals. We obsess over calories and macros. We judge people's portion sizes. We give up carbs before weddings. Eat this, not that. Eat more, eat less. I know the majority of you all viewing this have either experienced or witnessed some version of this. And that's heartbreaking. But notice how these same stories that at one point set us apart and ostracized us are now bringing us together as common ground to bond over and even laugh over despite the discomfort. That's what I mean when I say food tells stories. My own style is something I refer to as progressive cuisine, which sounds pretentious, but honestly, at its core, it's quite simple. It just means I ask questions. There are technical questions about the dish or the food itself, like, can I make this invisible? How can I trick my diner into tasting something that isn't there? How do you redefine a bun kebab? But there are also greater existential questions, and that's where the conversation gets interesting. Is there any originality in cuisine? What does it mean to create something? Take doodh soda. Love it or hate it, it's a Pakistani staple. But this drink's origins aren't Pakistani at all. In fact, it's a 17th century British invention where they used to mix milk and soda water together, like club soda. And that was a recreational beverage. When it came here, we began sweetening it because we have a sweet tooth. So we started adding sugar. But eventually, the cost of sugar and soda was more expensive than Sprite or 7-Up. We started mixing Sprite and 7-Up into it. So the Brits brought this to the mainstream, but we gave it masala. Do either of us own it? Along those lines, what is tradition? Is it the ingredients you use, or is it the spirit of a dish? A restaurant opened up here selling authentic Neapolitan pizza. Now, in order to qualify as Neapolitan, you have to have two things. One, it has to consist of San Marzano tomatoes. And two, it has to have buffalo mozzarella from Campania. But those things work in Naples because they're a driving distance away. In like 2 hours, you can get them all brought to your restaurant. So it arrives fresh daily. If you put those tomatoes in a tin and stuff it with preservatives, and you freeze that mozzarella and then have to unfreeze it a month later, is that consistent with the principles behind that pizza? Alternatively, what if it's not about the tomatoes and cheese? What if it's just using the highest quality, locally sourced produce available to you? What if you're getting tomatoes freshly picked from the orchard, dirt still on them, from a farmer whose family has been doing this for generations? What if you get buffalo mozzarella from an artisan in the city who's using milk from our local blue-eyed buffaloes that are really cute, but also like kind of creepy? It might not taste the same, but isn't that a more accurate reflection of what Neapolitan pizza is, which is a celebration of local produce and technique? But along those lines, what does shopping locally or organically even mean? Does local mean grown in Islamabad? Does it mean limited to the Sabzi Mandi and Itwar Bazaar or farms around the city? What about getting fresh herbs from Lahore or black currants from Skardu or rock lobster from Gwadar? Is it just using Pakistani produce rather than imported ingredients? What does organic mean? How much of the ability to farm organically and purchase these products is rooted in our privilege? Like, let's say there's one farmer who's been raising poultry for generations. His family did it, his grandparents did it, their grandparents did it. And then let's say there's a new privileged Islamabadi boy like me who suddenly starts an organic chicken coop. Are my eggs actually worth 3 times what his are? Even though his are ostensibly probably better quality, but he doesn't have the same resources to get that papa that makes it organic? How do you elevate cuisine without exploiting or commodifying it? Food, especially cultural staples, is one of the most unfortunate victims of capitalism. And it's often far removed from the people closest to it. Like if you think about for a second how many Asian restaurants we have in Islamabad alone, right? Now we think of how many countries are in Asia. There are 50 countries in Asia. Are you telling me that any of these restaurants is serving dishes from 50 different countries? Like, what is Asian food? How do we, in good faith, reduce the entirety of this continent, all 50 countries with its nationalities and cultures and histories? How do we reduce that to sushi, noodles, dumplings, and braised meat? There's a fine line between learning from a culture and profiteering off it. Now, the analogy I like to give when people ask me how I differentiate appreciation and appropriation is you're appreciating my food when you come to my dinners and you like my dishes so much that you ask me for the recipe and I give it to you and then you reproduce it. You're appropriating if you steal my cookbook, start your own restaurant using my recipes, present them as your own, and then leave me a bad review on Facebook or Instagram. So I don't know if there are any questions here because there usually aren't the questions this big, but it's important to ask the questions because that's how we expand our understanding of the world and also how we hold ourselves and the space we're in accountable. So for me, progression is about taking that step forward. It's adapting to new environments, ingredients, people. It's about not forgetting the past, but finding new ways to present and maintain its relevance. So we honor cuisines by exploring the crossroads and the intersections between them. So I struggle a bit with ADHD and I know how hard it is to sit through 15 minutes nonstop of a lecture. So I'd like to do an interactive activity with you guys, give you an example of what I'm talking about in a practical sense. So if there's people in the audience here on both YouTube and Zoom, I'd like you to suggest some desi dishes or desi ingredients. And I'm going to do a quick 2-minute game where I try to recreate that in a modernist way, which still respects the original story, but tells it in a new light. So go ahead, type stuff up if you guys want. And I'll give you 30 seconds, 45 seconds to submit, and then we'll go through that and make a couple of new dishes just intellectually, conceptually in front of you. Ooh, a lot of suggestions. Okay, cool. We'll do two. I see Shami kebab and Afghani burger. For Shami kebab, actually, there's a funny story about this. My first interaction with fusion, no, I don't call it fusion because fusion often requires a lot of appropriation. I call this crossroads or crossover cuisine, progressive Pakistani. So one of my first dishes was the Shami kebab, redefined, and I converted the Shami kebab into a golgappa. And it's because I blew it up into its core components. Great. Actually, someone said Golgappe. So this is actually going to show you the crossover from Shami to Golgappa. Shami kebab at its core is a couple of ingredients. A Shami burger, let's say. It's got a chickpea cutlet, which is the Shami. It's got a bun, which is a bread. It's got pickled onions. I forgot. Sirke wale pyaz. And it's got a sauce. So how do you recreate that in a way that still respects all those ingredients, but gives it to you in a new textural format? So when you look at it, you don't think this is a Shami Amde burger. I took the bun and I turned the bun into a golgappa, but I made my own golgappa with a bit more starchy flour. So it was actually quite chewy as well as crisp. It could hold the sauce. I took the Shami kebab and I emulsified it into a mousse, like a puree. That was piped inside the golgappa. It was topped with a pickled cucumber salad. And then it was topped with fried egg, which I had shaken through until it was like a crumble, crisp kind of floss. So all of this recreates all the original flavors. And I put a sauce of imli pani inside. So it looks like a golgappa. It smells like a golgappa. When you put it in your mouth, you get all the flavors of an ande wala burger. I do the same thing with an Afghani burger in a similar way, where let's say an Afghani burger is what? It is a naan, it is chips, and it is a hot dog and a chutney. What I'd do if I was to do it right off the top, I would turn it into a new style of a hot dog. So I would take a quality meat, like a cut from either goat or lamb. I'd slow braise that. I would chop it up or pull it along with, let's say, apples, diced potatoes, a little bit of chutney, and breadcrumbs. And I'd turn that into a whole new sausage. Then you just dip that in a batter and you fry it. So you have a corn dog, which is a very American or Western thing, but it's got all the flavors and ingredients that make up a good Afghani burger. So again, you look at it and you're like, I don't know what this is. And you taste it and it tastes like nostalgia. It tastes like home. So one of the most frequent questions I get is, what is the ghee spot? And honestly, it's one of the hardest to answer. I guess the simplest explanation is that it's my response to my experiences in the food industry. We talk about sustainability and food waste, and it's true, those are problems. But often we forget the human exploitation that occurs. When I was working at Ramsay, which is a subtle flex, we would routinely put in 80 to 100-hour weeks. And it's this way in most top restaurants, where you're working 6 a.m. till 1 a.m., 5 to 6 days a week, with one 30-minute break in between. That's not sustainable. It's a toxic and extremely ableist environment. And as someone who struggles with both anxiety and depression, it broke me. You know, most days I'd get home so exhausted that the only thing I had the energy to make was a bowl of cereal. So I'm working on the top restaurants on the planet, and I get home and my dinner is cornflakes. I'm so burnt out from cooking. So why do we work ourselves to the bone for the sake of this grind? Why do we dismiss people who burn out or can't handle it? Why do we call them soft? It's a byproduct of this entitlement we have to food 24/7 and ignorance of the person on the other side of the counter. Whether it's the fast food employee who's 2 minutes late with our burgers, or the sabzi wala we're haggling with over 10 rupees, we don't generally care. We don't care where our meat comes from or how it was treated before or after it was slaughtered. We don't care whether we're consuming vegetables or fish that are out of season. We don't care if we're accelerating their extinction or the ecological cost of doing it. So how have we allowed this to become norm, this to become mainstream and not the aberration? You know, or even the not so subtle classism that exists within fine dining and this culture of manners. Like, what are manners? Knowing which fork or which spoon to use during hushed conversations on white linen where everything is 2 inches apart? You know, why isn't there more laughter? Why aren't we eating with our hands? Why has this sterile, cynical approach to dining replaced the sensory carnival that a night out should be? So the ghee spot is my attempt to create an intersectionally feminist space which explores all of these crossovers. It's a place where I critically engage with concepts like sustainability or tradition and examine the structures whose authority we just unquestionably accept. It's a safe space where we can ask all these questions, the uncomfortable ones, and have these difficult conversations. Every ingredient is freshly sourced from within Pakistan. Where possible, I use small-scale family businesses. As a nation, we waste 40% of our food, both as raw ingredients and post-cooking biomass. So we have a zero waste policy where leftover ingredients that are raw are used to provide free meals for day laborers, and non-consumable food trim afterwards is composted to be reused as fertilizer. To reflect the global wage and employment gap, women diners pay 75% of what men do because that's the global wage gap. So let's say if men are paying 1,000, women are paying 750. And that difference in between goes towards distributing sustainable hygiene products in underserved areas. So we're literally funding menstrual hygiene. It's one thing to say, you know, woo, women's economic empowerment, feminism, and then you go and you hire a bunch of dudes for minimum wage. And that's not what I'm about. So I only hire and collaborate with women with preference given to marginalized members of society, so differently abled, religious minorities, trans women. Seasonality is a core tenet, right? So the chef's table is only open a few times a month. The employees only work 2-3 days a week because my personal belief is that the work week should be 3 days long. You need at least one day after to recover. You need one day at least to spend with your friends and family, one day to pursue your personal passions and projects, and then one day to handle the other demands of life. It's progressive Pakistani cuisine, where you're not just what you eat, but you're how you eat and where you eat as well. The menu is constantly evolving. It's an ode to our food tradition and the current season's harvest. Sometimes it's in this kitchen behind me. Sometimes it's a food truck. Sometimes it's a pop-up or a picnic. The conversation extends beyond just social justice, and we ask questions of the food itself. What can this ingredient do for us? And more importantly, what can I do to celebrate this ingredient? What is the next step of evolution for our culinary techniques? It's a place where we realize that as long as you're not being oppressive, there are no rules. Do whatever you want. Engage in your whimsy. Eat with your hands. Slurp your food. Lick the plate. I get this, and one of the biggest things I get when I talk about this isn't going to work. It's too idealistic. Men aren't going to get behind this. Your food is too esoteric. You need to scale. I hate that. You need to scale. You'll never make the big bucks. Real talk, right? Let's be completely honest. There are very few, if any, social movements or changes which didn't seem ridiculous or impossible at the time. That's the way we get gaslit into maintaining the status quo. So what happens if I fail? I get out there and I make something that doesn't. And you do that by getting it wrong over and over and over again. For the longest time, I couldn't make pie crusts. Like, it's a very simple thing. It's sugar, butter, flour, and some cold water. And I just couldn't do it. There's very little to hide behind, so you have to nail every part of it. And whenever I tried, it was either too thick or too thin, not enough butter, too much butter, undercooked, overcooked. And it demoralized me because here I am. I'm a chef who's worked in some of the best kitchens in the world, and I can't even make a pie crust. I think it's a family curse because my younger brother, Hisbert, he loves chicken pot pie, and he can't make pie crusts consistently either. Like, we struggle. So he'd asked me to help him, and one day he was making it and he was struggling, so I made him the crust, and it was perfect. And then a couple of months later, he was making it again, and he asked me to make the crust, and it was perfect. And this kept happening. And then one day he just turns to me and says, "Why is your pie crust consistently right?" And I realized it's because I've ruined more pie crusts than he's made overall, period. So don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to be a misfit. Don't be afraid to get it wrong, because you will. You will sound stupid. You will be weird. You will mess up your pie crusts. And that's fine, because you're still taking that one step forward. Thank you for attending my TED Talk. I've always wanted to say that.